G'day and welcome to a continuation of our studies, demos, workshops. I'm not entirely sure what to call them. They don't quite feel like full demos and they don't quite feel like full workshops. So kind of a mix between the two. But this is nonetheless the second part or a follow-on to our previous video that was about doing studies focusing on animals. But in this case, we're going to focus on buildings. Now, truth be told, there's not a big difference between doing studies on animals, plants, buildings, whatever it is that you potentially want to draw, you want to do a study on. There's really not a big difference in that we still have to worry about a couple of key things. So for example, we still have to worry about the geometry, we still have to worry about the proportions, right? Our large, medium, and small. Right, so we still have to worry about those elements, and of course, we have to worry a couple of other things such as, let's say, our surfaces along with our transitions, right? So we still have to worry about those things. None of that has really changed. But what makes buildings a little bit tricky, a little bit more different than if we're doing studies on other elements, again, people, animals, whatever it might be, what makes buildings really difficult is that they are massive, right? Now, a house relative to us is massive, right? A house, is very, very big. And so anything of a large scale, it tends to be a lot harder to do these things because unlike animals, unlike a car or maybe a household appliance, it has to do with familiarity, right? So obviously, most of if you guys are watching this, you're living somewhere, right? You're living in a house or an apartment or something like that. And so we have contact with structures. We have contact with buildings every day. And so you might be thinking, well, I'm pretty familiar with a building. What the hell do you mean with this, unfamiliarity, thing where what do you mean I don't know buildings? Well, what I mean specifically is that our awareness, right? Our awareness of the whole sort of 3D element of a building is not as thorough as, let's say, our awareness of, let's say a kettle or a car, even a bus. And the primary reason behind that is it's very easy for us to pick up a household item, right? Whether it might be, again, I'll use kind of the kettle example. Right? It's very easy for us to pick up a kettle and spin this guy around in all sorts of angles and directions, and we get a pretty good sense of the 3D-ness of this thing. Now, cars are a little bit bigger, so you can't exactly pick up a car, but what you're able to do with a car is that you can walk around it. So whether you have a bus or a sort of suburban car, right, you can kind of walk around this thing. Right? It's not that big that it prevents you from walking around it, and we deal with these things every day. Crossing the road, if you're just kind of walking down the street, you're going to walk past a lot of cars, whether they're moving or they're parked on the side, right? So our ability to walk around a car, to look over a car, is enough that we get, again, a pretty good sense of what this thing is going to be in 3D. So if you were to close your eyes, you could easily visualize what this would look like in 3D. And this can go up to something like a bus, right? Or even like a train carriage. Now, when we get to buildings, though, or in particular, we're just going to focus, we'll keep the scale relatively small for this particular video. We'll just talk about houses, right? We won't get to big sort of like 60, 70 story skyscrapers, things like that. We're going to keep it nice and simple. We're going to keep it to a house, something that you're more likely to be designing or drawing for concept art. Now, for most of us, we only have the one home. Right. So we know that, let's say for our, or some of us, depending on where you're living, we only really have access to the one home or the one house. And even then, the odds of us walking around this house completely is actually kind of low unless you've lived in a place for a long time. Sometimes with houses, you end up where there's a partition in the middle, there's a fence, you can't really see what's on the other side. Right? There might be as well trees coming down, on one side blocking a path, blocking a sight line, And also, it might just be a little bit impractical for us to get on top of the house, right, and look at it. And again, for some of us, we may not be living in a house. We may find ourselves living in an apartment. For example, right now, I'm living in an apartment. I have no idea really what my building looks like because a lot of the areas of my building, if I were to walk around it, are kind of blocked off, right? They're maintenance access areas. They might butt onto another building and so on. So I don't really have access to those things. So my familiarity with a building or with a house is a lot lower than, let's say, with a car or a conventional sort of a random household item. So this, or the lack of, shall we say, familiarity with the subject matter means that it is much harder for us to visualize when we, what we're trying to draw, even when we have a photo in front of us. It's much harder for us to visualize, and so it requires a lot of work. But our brain, we're simple humans, our brain keeps jumping back into thinking that, well, you should know this, you should be able to draw this. Drawing a building should be the same as drawing a car, a kettle, or a clock or whatever it is, or a table, right? It should be just the same. And yes, arguably, we can say that if you can draw one thing, in perspective, you should be able to draw everything else in perspective, right? If you know the rules of perspective, it's pretty much the same for everything that you draw. But this lack of familiarity with our subject matter adds an additional burden. You can almost say that we're handicapped when we have one arm tied behind our back when we're doing this sort of thing. So how is it then that we overcome that and we get a pretty good grasp of starting to draw these buildings, right? So what I'm going to cover in this demo is I'm going to work through a series of short exercises that are going to increase in difficulty to allow you to get into drawing buildings, to allow you to get into drawing structures where you're not immediately kind of at a snap of your fingers just overwhelmed with all this information, right? That you're dealing with it very slowly, because the worst thing that can happen is you jump into a drawing and it gets really difficult, and suddenly your morale just goes and you don't feel like drawing anymore because it's just too goddamn annoying. So I'm going to run through a process where we are going to start. All right, in terms of our process, we're actually going to start with side views. Now, typically speaking, I do not like side views at all. I think side views are really bad from a production point of view in that they don't provide as much information as sort of a three-quarter view or a view in perspective. However, I think side views are great in that they're very easy to do. They're very easy to draw. They're very easy to execute at a pretty high level. And so they're very good at building morale. And they're also pretty good, as a result of doing all that, they're pretty good at giving you an idea of what it is that you're actually drawing. So we're going to go into a process of side views, and then we're going to turn those side views into some basic perspective views. Right. Basic perspective views. Now, what exactly do I mean when I talk about sort of a basic perspective view? Because, well, the typical thing with perspective is like, well, basic perspective view, does it mean it goes into 1 point? Does it mean it goes into 2 point? We're actually going to be pushing it into a perspective drawing with no vanishing points, if that makes any sense. So a nice example would be, we start off with an image like this, and there's the side view. And our basic perspective view with, no perspective, well, no vanishing points, is that we are simply rotating this object around enough that we start to see, if this is the front face, that we start to see the side face. And what this does is this goes from 2D into now, I suppose we could call this 2.5D, right? And then finally, the third step that we're going to do is we're actually going to draw, or we're going to do our studies in a rough 3/4 view, right? So it's always good to remember that when you're doing studies, you don't necessarily want to copy one for one what you see. You're trying to understand the form, you're trying to understand the proportions. So it's always best to redraw it in a slightly different perspective. Even if it's just a little bit different than the photograph, it's still a lot more, you're still learning a lot more from that. Right? So that would be if we follow this path from 2D to 2.5D, right? It will then become something like this, where we're really getting into 3D. In which case now we see the front, the side, and the top. And this is a full-on 3D image. So we're going to take the same reference image and we're going to apply it through these 3 steps, right? And each step is designed to get us a little bit more familiar with what we're drawing. Right? I'm going to pull some basic images across different time periods. I'm going to keep them relatively simple. So as I mentioned before, while this is about buildings, I'm going to keep it to homes or houses, right? Sort of things that you're more than likely to see in a game or in a film. I'm shying away from big sort of monolithic buildings, because they, at the scale of these big buildings, let's say the Opera House, the Empire State Building, right, Sears Tower, something like that, or the I think it was the Space Needle in Seattle, or the Burj Khalifa, right? Those buildings at the scale that they're at, the size that they're at, that's more playing with shape, that's more playing with proportions, right, than anything else. And while they're really fun to do, and there's a lot of merit in doing studies based off those buildings, I think it's also very important that, particularly if you're looking at this particular series that have to do with studies, I think it's very important that we start small and then we slowly work our way up. It's benefiting no one if we jump into something that is really difficult, that's really sort of at a higher level, and if we do something like that, sure, I end up with a beautiful visual end for this video, but it's not really going to help you guys. It's not really going to help you at the end of the day when you're trying to figure out, like, well, how the hell do I draw these houses that I see in front of me when I'm at the park and I've got, I'm sitting on the bench and I'm doing some studies, right? Is that going to help? Not really. So we're going to do something that's a little bit more grounded, a little bit easier for us to comprehend and to appreciate. All right, so let's start off with some side views, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab I've got some images of just different sort of, I guess, single-story houses that I think are quite useful. So I've got a contemporary one. I think this building was probably built in probably the 30s or 40s, something like this. And then we've got some classic sort of European style huts as well. And I've got something that's a little bit more modern. And thankfully this is already in a sort of a flat side view, so that saves us a little bit of time. But let me go ahead and start to arrange these nice and neatly. So I always like things to tee up a little, I like things to look pretty neat, because if I'm going to be staring at something for a while, I want whatever it is I'm looking at to look pretty good, right? Or at least be kind of neat. Have a level of, I guess, professionalism behind it. No, professionalism is probably not the right word. I guess I just like it to look nice. Right? No real sort of weird agenda behind it. I want it to look nice. So let's start off with a drawing like this. And so with a drawing like this, well, this drawing kind of gives us everything that we want already. But I'm still going to go through, it still has a little bit of a one-point perspective shot. And what I want to do is I just want to start to go through and thinking about my proportions in terms of my large, medium, and small. I want to start drawing this building out. And I'm just going to sketch it through. In this case, with the perspective, there's a little bit of a kink coming out there, but really that doesn't exist so much, right? Because in the plan view without any perspective, that's not really there. I'm just looking at the overall proportions of it. It seems relatively simple. This is not a complex design, and I would imagine that the designer as well probably didn't entail the architect, so I didn't intend for this to be a complicated design either. Now, one thing you realize is that I've actually lined up the windows, right? Typically speaking, for most suburban homes or most man-made structures, windows are going to be pretty uniform in terms of their height, where they start and where they end, right? Because they have to accommodate us, because, you know, particularly for a residential home, people have to live in it, so they need to conform to what humans are in terms of our size, our average height, and all that sort of stuff. We got this section that looks like it kind of comes down here. Like another roof section, a bit of an awning, and then that kind of, I think that mirrors this part. Again, it makes it a lot easier because we're dealing with a flat view. There's no real perspective on this. In terms of just figuring out the mirror on this other side. Again, my drawing doesn't have to be perfect, and neither does my representation, right, of my original photograph, because there's just going to be some things that you just can't see, and so you kind of have to make it up. All right, just going to rotate a little bit just to extend this, because it does come down on the other side, and it would appear that the roofs tend to share the same angle. So I'm just going to correct this one up here. Now we've got these big windows on the other side, back here, and they're kind of cropped. This, it feels like it drops down about there. And then there is another window. I think there's a door here. Some form of landing that's going to come up. Door's going to sit there with a little bit of glass. And then our window is going to sit somewhere here. There's a little bit of a fence post, not fence post, sorry, there's a little bit of a fenced backyard over here. And I think on this side, I think it might be a slope over here because it's got kind of these boxed walls or retaining walls, something like this. So while you're looking at this, you might be thinking, well, this is crap, right? This is shit. What the hell? You're just drawing a side view of this image here. But even, yes, I'm drawing this and it's very easy. I'm not gonna lie, this is, you know, about as brain dead as it gets when you're dealing with drawings. But you'll notice that as I was drawing this, I was looking back at the image and studying a few things in that I kind of realized, hey, for this design, it appears that all the rooftops are parallel to each other, right? At least the angles that they're traveling. So this guy and this guy should be parallel to each other. Right. I'm noticing that, yeah, across the entire image, the windows all line up, right? Looking at the fence and the garage door, I can also start looking at, okay, well, what is the average? I can kind of start figuring out what the average height of a human might be standing in this place relative to all the other elements. So while the drawing may be very simple, we also need to remember that, hey, what's the point? Why are you doing these drawings? And you're doing these drawings to study what the subject matter is, whether you're studying how to draw an animal, or if you're studying how to draw a rocket ship or anything like that. The whole point of studies is to get you pretty familiar with the subject matter, right? So you start to pick up on patterns, you start to notice correlations and similarities between certain elements within that subject matter, right? And so that's the whole point of why we would go through the trouble of doing this. Otherwise, yeah, this is a very simple image and it's kind of boring, right? And if we were just drawing this for the sake of drawing this, I would say, well, that's, while fun, potentially a bit of a waste of time, right? Right, so that's our modern house. Let's shift this guy over here. And let's have a look at this one here. So this one is not completely in a sort of a direct front view. We are looking at something that's kind of a little bit of it's still a little bit of a one-point perspective shot, in that we can definitely see that, the primary angles that we're seeing, it's got a VP kind of dead center here, right? But we can argue that it is, it is a 2-point perspective drawing or 2-point perspective image. But it's not quite sort of the classic 2-point like the one we have down here. But again, we have enough information. So again, I'm going to draw, get a ground plane first. And I'm looking at the breakdown. It looks like the overall size, if I take this as being that, the overall size of this building, so it should be a little bit wider. I think we have sort of a medium spot here, and then we have a small sort of section there. We know that there is a big sort of window here. I'm also cheating a little bit because I think I actually know this house. I think it's near where I grew up. I'm looking at it and like, geez, this looks kind of familiar. So I found these images, definitely not these two, but I found these two up here from a real estate website or from some realty websites. I think they're really good references for finding things like buildings and houses, right? Because they'll get some, when we're looking for buildings, if you just kind of type in a house online, you generally get some really interesting ones, right? Really cool looking, unique buildings or houses. And I think they're all well and good. They're all kind of fine, but sometimes you just want something that's a little bit more boring. Sometimes it's something a little bit more low key. And I think real estate websites are a really good place for that. So it's got a little sort of electrical box over here that I need to put in. And then again, the windows seem to line up. If that's because, even though there's a step going up to this door, inside this house, things are going to be on the same level. And this seems to be following the same rule in terms of we've got a big sort of glass or window in the middle. And in this case, it's partitioned out. Something like this. And we have the same style partitioning in the front windows. And so most likely, these guys are probably going to line up as well. Let's kind of get rid of the stuff that we don't need. If you're sketching and you're not working digitally and you can't really erase, you can fatten that up with line weight. Now, we can see that over here, I think this is where the brickwork ends. And it actually has, I think there's a bit of an incline. So there's a stone sort of rendition on the side. And we can also see that there's a little bit of a sort of a small little, I want to call it a wall, but it's not really a wall. I guess kind of just like a barrier for some of the bushes in the garden, right? I'm going to put them in. Some flowers here, and I think there's a little sort of miniature tree looking thing here. I'm terrible with plants, so I'm sure this thing has a name, and I'm sure for those of you who have a garden or who know quite a bit about plants, it's probably really obvious. But I have never really had much of a green thumb, so I have no idea. I've been trying to grow basil in my like a little kitchen garden for the last couple of months, and I think I've gone through like 4 different basil plants. I keep killing them. I'm not great at this. All right, so there's a little section here. Almost forgot about this part. And this is going to match up with everything else. But from this image, it looks like this window is just kind of by itself. It doesn't seem to have any partitions. And we can see that same sort of brickwork or brick veneer come up at the bottom here. A little retaining barrier. And then there's some, I guess there's some hedges or something that might go around here. There's some flower thing that sits there. We can detail out a little bit of this sort of stone masonry sort of facade. Just to remind ourselves. And we also have a little garden. This blocks quite a bit. I could call it a day and say like, okay, well, this is it. But since I put in the garden, and it looks like from the top, I'm guessing just from this image, that retaining sort of barrier circles across like this. So I think it's also important then that we place that in. Right. So again, the whole point of studying is we're trying to understand what we're looking at, and we're trying to break it down. It looks like it's got a pretty big, I think it's probably a tree, a little sort of little tree in the back. It's got some other bushes there. Let's have a look at the roof. So there's the wall that's going to come up, and the roof is going to extend a little bit past that, and then straight in the middle. Now this type of roofing, it has a name. Unfortunately, the name escapes me right now. But you know, if you're interested, you can find out. I just want to zoom in a little bit because I want to see what the hell goes on here. So that cuts back. So this goes up, and I guess this is the apex of it, and then there's another section that comes down here. So I guess this is gonna stay firm. Actually, I think it's a little bit lower. Right, single-story building, it's not gonna have a lot in terms of the height. It's going to cut about there, I feel, and it's probably going to follow the same slope, so we can actually determine roughly what that angle is in terms of where we might connect it back here, just by trying to make sure that these guys are parallel to each other. Right, again, they seem to have this sort of formula to them. Now, I did make a mistake because this protrudes out a little bit more, so that allows it to be a little bit lower. It looks like they're about parallel to each other, and it looks like this kind of just connects back here, right? So it kind of breaks that rule a little bit, unless of course there's a section that kind of punts out here that I can't see. And I'm going to say that there is, because I'm looking at this study and I'm trying to identify any patterns, and I think the pattern that I'm seeing is that these sort of roofline angles coming down have to be parallel to each other. And it looks like following this, there is a chimney. Kind of comes up. And there's a sort of an arrow up there, but I'm not going to put that in because I think it's getting a little bit too pedantic. So in this case, I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to add some line weight. So if you're sketching this out, and you're using sort of traditional media like pen and paper, that sort of stuff, then the way that, you know, when you're drawing this, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to put in lines that exist only to help you figure out another line. Line weight is very useful then in allowing you to knock some of the elements that you don't want backwards. Right, so for example, right now, if I kind of beef up the line work towards this front section of the house that protrudes a little bit more. Same thing over here. It starts to push the other parts back a little bit without necessarily putting a shadow in. Now, if you want to put a shadow in, I think that's, you know, that's fine. I mean, these are studies. At the end of the day, they exist purely to help you get a better sense of, better understanding of what it is that you're drawing. So whatever helps, right, get you a better understanding of it, I think that works really well. Right, so let's kind of do this. Let's kind of pop some of these windows out a little bit more. That one went a little awry. Gonna highlight that a little bit. Alright, so again, looking at the image, trying to replicate it as my studies and doing them as side views. And again, side views are incredibly simple. They're very fast to do. They're not very stressful at all. So that means that if you make a mistake, it doesn't really matter. You're not going to feel that pressure that you might feel if you were doing a much larger image. So in fact, because they're much smaller, you could do quite a number of these without getting tired. Let's have a look at this one. So again, for this one though, like both sides look kind of interesting. So you just have to, you know, for this one, why don't we do both, you know, both sides? Let's do this, right? This side here, and then we'll do this side with another drawing. So again, the front view, try and get an idea of this building. It's relatively blocky. It's a little bit more square than rectangle. Roof line comes down, something like this. Nice thing about medieval or sort of, I guess, yeah, like buildings like these is that, well, they're kind of built a little rougher, so we can be a little, we don't have to be as precise, and so that can take a load off. And it looks like there's something over here. I'm not sure if that's a window or anything, but definitely there's a door. It's quite a wide door as well. And we can see it's sort of the supports for the door. Actually, I think this may not be like a house. I think this might be like a pen or something. It looks like there's some steps going up there. And, you know, for the sides, it's got these sort of log cabin sides. So I'm just going to put little kind of indications. And I'm not going to draw every beam that runs across because that's going to give me like a really weird image. Right, so I'm just going to put a few lines just to indicate that it's kind of like a log building. There are the supports for the roofs, or the roof, I guess, because you know, it's one single roof. And this guy has supports as well. And just for this image, they probably line up, but I'm just going to space them out a little bit more, just so that it's not as doesn't get in the way as much as a drawing. I'm just going to have supports on the other side. I think I drew this wall a little bit too much on the inside of things. I think that starts to look a little closer. Just thinking out some of these lines just so that it reads a little bit clearer. And it's got like these little knickknacks. You know, you don't necessarily have to put them in, but I think it's kind of fun. Just adds a little bit more life to otherwise what's a really bland drawing. In fact, I want to zoom in to see what else is there. I think there's a bit of a wooden horse, which is a little bit hard to replicate, but it appears that there's something, I have no idea what this thing is, but there's something there. And what's really cool by zooming in, as I zoomed in, I realized is that the roof line is broken into 4 sections, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there's a distinct kind of separation between the two. And I'd imagine that probably applies to the other side. I can't see the other side, but I'm going to guess and say, well, if it's on one side of it, it's probably going to be on the other side. Right? Generally, humans, when we build things, we tend to build things relatively symmetrical or relatively symmetrically. It's pretty hard for our brains to come up with asymmetrical designs. It's pretty hard for our brain to focus on asymmetrical things. It's just not the things that the typical person in the street finds visually appealing or something that they think a lot about. Generally, our world is pretty symmetrical, right? Human beings, we are, we're not 100% symmetrical, but we're pretty damn close. And that's also how we ascertain, in terms of, as far as evolution is concerned, how we find mates and how, what we find attractive and not attractive. And a lot of it boils down into symmetry. So here's the front of it, but let me do the side. So I can use this as a rough guide as well to keep them kind of, keep everything in line. This definitely pokes out. And I should be able to see some of the supports. Now, some of these supports are very crooked in the photo. I'm purposely keeping everything kind of slim or kind of straight just because, well, I'm trying to focus just on the big things. I don't want to get too lost in the details. This building doesn't look like there's anything on the other side, but what there is this nice sort of build up of grass, or this sort of looks like some form of ivy or something. This is a nice build up, and as I'm drawing this and I'm kind of putting this in, I'm realizing that I think I've drawn my building a little bit too wide, and so let's bring it in. Let's line these guys up. Now there's a little bit of foreshortening in here just because of the I guess the angle of the roof. So it comes in a little narrower than you might think. There's a little bit of a bend here. Don't have to really put it in there, but I think something a little bit more as simple as a side view, it's worthwhile putting in. That means that we can introduce it down here as well, because if it's going to compress up here, it's going to compress down there as well. And I would imagine that with a building like this, it's probably again going to be symmetrical on the other side. Might not be, but I'm just assuming. I can't see the other side of the building. But I'm guessing, as I mentioned before, most buildings that humans kind of make end up being pretty symmetrical. So I'm just based off that, I'm going to make that assumption. All right, so we've got two side views, same building, just from a slightly different angle. Well, not slightly different, but from a completely different angle. But still very quick in terms of doing these side views. And let's do one more. We'll do this one down here. So as I'm doing this, and I'm kind of talking about what I'm doing, hopefully you guys start to get an idea of, again, when we do these studies, what is it that we're going after, right? So I talked at length about this when I was doing the animal demo, the previous one to this, and hopefully just by kind of watching this and hearing more of it, it's it kind of sinks in a little bit more, right? That repetition helps a little bit. So this time I've got a door straight in the middle. And it goes quite high, it goes up to about here. So something like this. And I'm not sure what is this going down here. Alright, so they're just supports. So let's make this a little bit wider. And then we've got supports coming in over here. And supports coming in at the bottom. Doesn't have to be perfectly straight. Looks like for a lot of this stuff for this building, it's kind of just looks a little bit ramshackled. I'll hand over here. And let's see what else. Okay, this whole thing looks it's kind of very rustic. It's got these logs coming out on one side, and it's going to have them kind of butting out on the other side as well. So I got something hung up here. I think that's a bear trap or something. It doesn't really matter what it is. I've got some wheels on the side. These look more decorative than anything else. Another sort of big wagon wheel down here. There's like random elements kind of coming up. There's a little bench. It's kind of fallen, starting to fall over or tilt on this side. And I see some of these logs. See some gaps in there. It looks like there's a pot or a jug. Got other elements there. Some bits of the timber have kind of been worn out. So we get some nice sort of texture running through. Again, for something like this, it looks like that they've kind of stacked the roofs. So use line weight to kind of help thicken some of this out a little bit more so it reads a little clearer. Because when you're drawing this, while it reads really clear as you're drawing it, if you come back later and look at it, sometimes you come back and you see some of the drawings you do and you're like, I have no idea what what is an object line, what is a construction line, and so forth. So it's always nice to kind of just use a little bit of line weight just to make sure that things are a little bit clearer. And it looks like there's just like random bits on the front propped up against this. Okay, so we've got, in this case, 4 different buildings, 4 different front views. Right, now, my line weight got a little heavier as I went through, and so I'm just going to go in and bring that same level of line weight to this drawing here, so it's a little bit more even, or a little bit more homogeneous. So I tend to find that, at least for myself, when I first start drawing, like, my line work generally is pretty light, and as I draw more, as I warm up, they get heavier and heavier, right? And that's, I think for me that's because when I start drawing and I haven't really warmed up, I am being very ginger with everything that I do. I'm being very precious with everything that I do, and then just as I start to draw more, that sort of I suppose that uncertainty or that sort of level of care, I guess, that just disappears, and I'm getting, I get a lot more heavy-handed with my drawings. And sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes we do need things that are quite light, and then sometimes it does pay just to kind of really go to town with that line work. Right, really kind of thicken it out. I forgot over here, I actually got some sort of these window or these glass sections coming down from the garage. Let's just put those in. There's a little bit of framing here. Let's just thicken this line weight to make sure that really pops out. So yeah, we've got these 4 side views. So what do we do with this? Well, at this point now, we're going to take these and we're going to do that slight turnaround. So rather than sort of bore you guys with doing all of these, I'm going to take 2 of them and I'm going to rotate them around. So just to, since we have this one already, which is sort of turn around, I think this would make for a nice example of that sort of 2.5 sort of D image. And I'll take this suburban house as well. So it's going to grab these guys, copy them, and we'll take them and just move them to the side, and we'll just do like a direct drawing on the other side over here. Oops, it's zoomed in a little bit too far. All right. So we mentioned before that we would take something like this, let's say a front view, and this is our 2D version, and then we are going to upgrade it, right, based on our familiarity, into something where it's kind of more a 2.5D image. So that's what we're going to do with these images. And we kind of have enough information from our reference images to get a pretty good idea. So let's go ahead and take this one first. So I'm just going to keep this zoomed out. And let's continue that. So if I take this building and I start to rotate it, right, then even if I just follow this, I know that at least for this section, I'm going to get something like this. That's going to come out. This looks like it's recessed in. And so that, if I have the stairs kind of sitting along here, if I follow this across all the way, it gives it there. These stairs kind of come down something like this. They wrap around. Right, and I'm just going to show a sliver of that alcove in there where the door is. And I can place the power box out over here. Go in and actually let's do some subdivisions to figure out the actual width, to get the correct width. So we get something like this. And since it is on an angle, we're definitely going to be able to see that little recess. There's a little feature here with some of this brickwork coming out on a bit of an angle. It sounds like I've got something kind of stuck in my throat, but let's persevere and keep drawing. All right, so we've got this wall that's going to come out, and it's going to go about, I'd say, about this far. Because for shortening, everything is going to end up kind of a little bit more squished in than before. Looks like there's a little bit of that wall that comes in. And before I run out of space, let's shift this all the way across. That's going to come this way. And this is where we're going to see that sliver with that window running through. Now again, because all our lines are still running with no perspective, more or less, that is, everything's kind of parallel, it's quite easy for us to pull these lines out to figure out where windows are going to be sitting. All right, and when we're actually drawing this in perspective, that can get rather tricky. Right? But since there's no real perspective right now, it does make our life a hell of a lot easier. So there's that recess on this side. I think this has got that little bump as well. This little thing by the window. Get that little alcove in. I think there's a little, I think there's some form of street name or number here. And actually this should be a lot higher because it goes all the way up to the roof line. Should sit somewhere like this. I'm not sure if that side has it because there's that tree in the way. But again, if we're looking at these studies, if it appears twice already, it's probably going to appear for a third time, right? Because again, humans like consistency. Now, this can get a little bit confusing, so I'm going to put in my line weight early. And that's just going to help me get a better sense of the depth. I could as well, at this point, maybe start to put in some very sort of basic shadows. Just again, the whole thing is just help remind me where my forms are. And if we follow this, this should drop down. And then we should have this sort of circular rectangle. It looks like it starts right there. So something like this. It's that retaining wall. Again, we can have our kind of that bush come up there, or that shrub, or flowers, and then we have that tree that's going to, that little ficus plant sort of thing. Let's sit about there. Not much is happening here. We still have the that sort of I don't know, I guess that I don't know, whatever that is, like a decal sort of thing. Some bushes down here, or a hedge it looks like. Plants. And then that is still going to come out on this side and curve around. Now again, because there's no perspective on this, everything is still relatively flat, and we'll still have some of those plant features, and then we're going to have that tree sitting in front. Now you can see straight away there's some minor differences between this drawing and this. It's just as I move things around, you know, the scale is not going to be exactly the same as the original, and that's fine. It's not studies are not meant to be, at least in the context that I'm covering studies, they're not supposed to be one-to-one representations. Right? I'll put these guys in because they are an architectural element. They're not meant to be one-to-one representations. They're meant to be an exercise to help us get an idea of what this thing is supposed to look like. Now, arguably we can say like, well, you know, this is a different view, so each time we upgrade this, the quality of the drawing goes up as well. And that's certainly true. But I think it's very important that, you know, for a lot of people when they're doing this, is to have that realization that it's not about getting things to be perfect. Right? We are definitely not in the business of doing like a one-to-one representation. There's plenty of other fields where that is important, and that is exactly what people want. But in the context of design or concept art, it's not quite what we're looking for. And so our studies are going to reflect that. Let's bring this over here. That's that first apex coming up. It's going to come up here. It's probably going to look something like this. And then there's going to be another part that runs up there, and it's going to go there, and then this is going to run back. It's going to go there, and then this corner is going to come up. That's going to run back here. Such a tiny sliver, and then finally that's going to come back there, and we'll see one at the back over here. Going to be a capstone for these tiles, and we want to look at the chimney. Looks like the chimney is actually running right there. Again, I'm just using this to line up, but you know, if you want to draw it fresh and you don't want to line things up, that's perfectly fine. As I mentioned before, not after a one-to-one, right? So if we can just get the overall basics to look like what they're supposed to look like, I think we're doing pretty well. And so this roof is going to be a little bit like this. I think this can be a little bit higher. Maybe before I had it a little bit too low, just because of the angle that I draw it at. So here's our drawing, right, where we kind of rotated that image around. This is getting a little bit hard to see in terms of what faces what, so I'm actually going to put in a pretty strong shadow that's going to help make it a little bit clearer as to which side is which in that, you know, what is the front side, what is the back side, and so on. That just helps it a little bit more. So there's that translation across. And oh, let's put in the window details. Almost forgot about those. Because if we jump straight into doing a 3/4 view drawing of this, it can be overwhelming. But here we're doing it step by step, so it doesn't feel that scary. It doesn't feel that overwhelming. Again, you can apply this to what I personally feel is that this is extremely applicable to large-scale things, right? Because large-scale things can be, as I mentioned before, they can be incredibly overwhelming. So it's quite useful. So let's go ahead and do it to this one down here, and I'm going to do a little bit larger. try and get a little bit more detail in it. So if we're looking at this particular version, I've got the two faces. I got front, and I've actually, I've got the side that I drew before. So that should, in theory, make my job a little bit easier. But what I'm going to do this time, I'm going to approach it a little bit differently. And that is, I'm going to draw it as kind of a cube or a box first. Right, something like this. And then I'm going to start to cut into it. So a little bit more of a perspective sort of viscom way of doing things. Let's see, that's a pretty shallow cut, something like this. And the rest I can kind of do it by eye. Into a building. I had this protruding like evenly at the back, but actually looking at this image, it doesn't seem like that. It seems to run a little bit shorter than the front, which would make sense. Because if you're, this is the front awning, so it's probably going to be treated a little bit differently than the back. That's going to come down. There's that central beam that runs across the supported. And then we've got some support beams. Again, really cool thing about this time period or this sort of style of building is that it's pretty rough and tumble. Let's kind of get rid of this so it's not too confusing. And as I mentioned before, it looks like it had some stairs. Coming out, it had these really big barn doors. And I actually think I've actually made this a little too tall. So I think let's raise it about there. So obviously if you're working this, if you're doing this traditionally, there's no way you can do that, but you can just kind of manually cut a line across to get rid of some of the things that you didn't necessarily want. Areas that you thought, you might have overdone it. Let's get these sections in. It's got that little plaque thing up here, a little signage thing. And again, this kind of style, it's kind of like that cross beam. So at this point, we have to be a little bit more careful. Since at this time, we can't just draw a line to run down. We actually need to go in and draw these guys. Areas, the lugs are going to come across in this area. Probably not going to see like that point that sticks out on the other side, just because this protrusion is probably going to hide it. Put some shadows in here. Let's not forget about this sort of step over here. There's that sign. And there's probably some supports around the frame of the door. Otherwise, it's going to be a really flimsy sort of structure. So on this side, you're going to see the same thing in terms of these sort of elliptical or circular logs coming through. But unlike the other side, because that's kind of hindered, we will see the corresponding edge come out. And you get these nice sort of, let's actually link this together very roughly. I want to see that joinery that's going to come through here. Let's thicken out this support. I don't want it to get lost. Really want to show that this guy sits in front of whatever joinery that might happen here. I'm not going to get too fixated on exactly how this thing gets connected in terms of how things are joined up. because that stuff is right now not that important. Just want to get most of the forms in. Now I know that the door itself is a little bit more kind of rustic, a little bit, yeah, a little bit more rustic, but for now, I think this is fine. I might have some few details, just showing the planks of the doors coming down. This side a little bit more of the shadows of you might get from these logs. Looks like there's some form of other support up here. These logs are going to keep going up. It's going to come down over here. Very clear that this kind of sticks way above the other side. Let's drop this down over here. And let's start to put in those sort of that layering that they have on that roof. It's a little bit uneven, so again that gives us a little bit more space to work with. Now I'm using a lot of shadow work in terms of kind of some shadows doubling up as line weight or vice versa. That's just kind of how I draw. Haven't really thought much about it, but if you're just wondering, you know, because I am kind of, sometimes I talk about line weight, but then when I'm using line weight, I'm also putting down so these thicker lines for shadows. I kind of have a habit of just combining them sometimes. If you're wondering, that's kind of the case. It's just the way that I draw. Everybody's going to have a different style when they're drawing, right? Because you know we all see the world a little bit differently. So how we translate that information is going to be a little different as well. But drawing into difference, you know, you can't use. Please don't use you know, the whole excuse of this is my style or something as a crutch for bad perspective. Bad perspective is just bad perspective. That's not a style. That's just, you know, that's just your shit at your work. That's pretty much it. Any style, any good, you know, any worthwhile style is going to have perspective on it, right? Even things that might appear as though they don't have great perspective, there will be a rhythm. They'll have a set of rules inside that is going to allow it to work. And the excuse of just, you know, if you have bad perspective and you just say, well, this is my style, yeah, that doesn't really cut it. That's it's pretty easy to see through. When you have bad perspective, just try and fix it. You know, everybody knows that. Well, you know, anybody who's drawn knows that perspective is a tricky thing to get a handle on. It's not always, you know, it's not always going to come out 100% as much as you might want it. So if you make a mistake with your perspective, just, you know, own up to it, try and fix it. And if you can't and it's still a little bit wonky, leave it be. And when someone asks you, why does it look like that? Just be very honest and say, well, you know, it's I screwed up on my perspective, or I couldn't quite figure out how this thing is supposed to look in this particular perspective. No shame in that whatsoever. But there is a lot of nasty side eyes if you try and, you know, try and find an excuse of saying that your style or your lack of perspective is a style. It's because it's kind of like saying, you know, if you habitually undercook food, undercooked chicken, where it might be potentially hazardous, and you run a restaurant, you know, you can't exactly tell people like, well, that's my style of cooking chicken. I like to undercook it and give everybody salmonella poisoning. That's my thing. That's not really going to cut it. I hate cooking chicken for that reason. I can never get my chicken to cook right. I always end up overcooking it because I get paranoid. it looks like a lot of this extends up behind it. Let's try and put a couple of these shadows for the logs running through just to balance it out a little bit. And it does have some of these elements at the front in terms of, I think it's like some form of carving on the front. So let's put some of these in. I think there's like a box or something here, just to help add a little bit of life. So you zoom in and have a look. Okay, so it's got like a piece of hide hanging from here. I'm going to put that in. It's got some, I think that table is going to block too much of this. It's got a rock sitting up here. I thought it was like a leg of ham or something. It seemed a little bit odd, but I guess there's a rock up there. And, you know, it's got some other little bits and bobs kind of hanging around. I think it's an axe. All right, if I'm looking at this right now, here is my side view, well, my 2.5D version, but I've noticed I've drawn this side a little bit too wide, so I'm just going to squeeze this, you know, condense this side a little bit more. Again, if you're not doing this on digital, that's going to be a little bit hard. Just going to add in a little bit of a shadow, just to help sell a little bit more of that 3D-ness. Coming through. Okay, just make these a little bit wider, a little bit thicker. Those can be a little bit hard to see. All right, so I'm just exaggerating certain things here and there just so that it reads a little bit easier. Otherwise, some of this can easily get lost. All right, so our 2D image translated across into 2.5D. Right, same thing over here. Here is our 2D version, and it's getting translated across into our 2.5D version. So the next stage is we'll move on to part 3 or stage 3, which is we're going to take this and, well, one of these buildings, maybe, you know, I might try another one. You know, I guess I'll make up my I'll make a decision and then, you know, as I talk. But I'll take one of these drawings and then I'll take it from 2.5D into you know, a 3/4 view, like a full 3D view, and you know we'll go through that drawing process, right? But hopefully, even at this stage, it's very clear that process or that progression, right? We're slowly layering on the difficulty. We're slowly, you know, through these exercises, getting a better handle of what that subject matter is, as opposed to kind of just jumping into it straight away, which can be very, very overwhelming. All right, so let me just turn this off, and I think just to make things a little bit interesting, let me kind of get rid of this. So we've already done the 2.5 views for this one and for this one as well. So I think let's make things a little bit more challenging, especially since we're doing a 3/4 view. Let's take this one over here, this sort of more modernist building. So I'm going to copy that, drop it in here. And let's do a quarter angle view of this, right? So with the information here, we could very easily take this into a 2.5D drawing, sort of like a rotated non-perspective view. But let's jump that step since we kind of did it with this previous set. And let's just go straight into the quarter angle shot. So I'm just going to scale this down so I get a little bit more space. I don't want to be too precise with this. I mean, obviously, the more precise we are with our drawings, the better it is. But I don't want to be too precise in that I don't want to get bogged down in the nitty-gritty of perspective, right? And that I'm not really looking to plot everything out. Again, the whole point of doing these studies is to help us get a better idea of what this thing that we're drawing, what is it as a, in terms of understanding this shape or this form in 3D. So I do want to purposely be a little bit looser, and I just want to be a little bit looser so I can work a little, perhaps not necessarily faster, but a little less encumbered, right? Because perspective, while very, very important, it does have a habit of really kind of slowing things down. Or kind of, well, I shouldn't say slowing things down. There's a tendency to kind of, I suppose slowing things down is probably the best way to word it. But I don't want to give it kind of that negative connotation, because it is a pretty important aspect, and slowing it down to get your perspective right, I don't want to give the impression that it's a bad thing. As we need that perspective to be able to sell our drawings, right? I'm very fond of the analogy that perspective is kind of like a language. It's the common language that we have for drawing. And so we need to make sure that because it's that common language, that we got to get it right so that everybody can understand what it is that we are trying to do. Right. So you'll see that as I'm drawing this as in a 3/4 view, the first thing I did was I picked a large section, which is this sort of main section here, and I carved into it, right? It's a little bit hard to do sort of a mid-plane mid-plane extrusion because it's not a symmetrical design. Something like these little huts down here work really well for that, but for this it's asymmetrical, so I think it's a better way to kind of cut into it rather than try and create a mid-plane and then from there extrude on either side. But regardless of what you're doing, one of the main things you want to do especially when you're doing 3/4 views, is that you want to make sure that you are kind of picking a big section, like a big chunk like this, or something that's easily recognizable, and you use that as a way to subdivide your drawing, in that you're using that as your gauge. You're trying to use that to figure out whether or not whatever it is that you're drawing, if it's in proportion to everything else. Now for vehicles, we tend to use wheels for that. Like wheelbase is kind of the traditional way when we're dealing with vehicles to find out how large something is or how wide, etc. But you can't really use wheels when you're dealing with buildings, right? It's a little bit harder. So I would suggest find something that you can easily replicate. I don't really know how deep this part goes, so I have to estimate it. And again, that part is not that it's not that important in that for us to get it perfectly right. We just need to get it pretty close, and from there, we can adjust accordingly. Now, if I look right, I think that section here with the door is connected to that. I think it's one section. So if it's one section, let's go ahead and actually continue that through. And I'm doing this all kind of freehand, or we'll obviously with the aid of the shift key in Photoshop to kind of keep some of these lines a little bit straighter. But it is more or less kind of freehand, so my perspective is going to be a little bit wonky. I'm just matching up to that height, so that height comes out, so it's about there. This comes down, so this is kind of sit about there. And that means that we can actually make this a little bit narrower. Let's kind of erase this so it doesn't get in the way. So we're looking at something like this. That's going to come across. Again, dealing with most of this as if it's just a sort of a block, and then cutting into it or adding parts to it. Ultimately, it's just about, I just want to keep this thing as simple as possible. I don't want to make it too difficult. I don't want to overcomplicate this thing. I really just want this process to be nice and simple. We've got enough as it is in our plates and in life that makes life pretty difficult, pretty complicated. We don't really need it when we're just trying to do some studies. Now there is an awning, it seems like this extends out. The roof, not necessarily the structure, but the roof is going to extend out something like so. I think there's a pillar over here that comes up. It sits there, so that means that that roof is probably only about there. Let's go ahead and get rid of the rest. And then we've got these two rooms. They're kind of in a stagger formation, so I can imagine that they actually, this one in here actually stacks up to the front of this building, or at least this section on this side. Again, looking back at our drawings, it's very clear that everything is parallel. That is, the roof line, the angle of the roof is parallel. I'm just going to extend it back here. Bring it over. Oops, keep hitting the wrong hotkey. Something like this, and then we've got this other section that sits probably, I imagine, not too far back, probably somewhere there. And it only extends to about there. And we've got this angle that we need to follow with the roof. And this guy kind of sits a little bit over here. And they're going to follow the same sort of angle as this. Pretty close, yeah. Generally, that saying close enough is good enough is something that I don't particularly like, but definitely for studies, I think it's very appropriate. And again, we want to be a little bit more relaxed when we do our studies. We're trying to get as much information as we can, right? And so if you're stressing yourself out, you're not really going to absorb a lot of that information. So got the basics of it right now. I might modify some of the proportions a little bit, but overall, I'm trying to get the form. I think it's a little bit lower than what I would like. So I might kind of extend it a little bit just to make it a little bit higher. Overall, such a minor change shouldn't affect too much with the rest of the plotting. Probably just a fraction. Yeah, probably about half of that, I think. I think that works well. Now, if we were trying to, let's say, draw this, get the perspective really, really top notch, and our goal is to replicate something, what our image is, sort of as a one-to-one replication, then we would definitely need to go in and do a lot more work. But in this case, it's really just about getting an approximation. Right, studies, at least in the context that I am engaging with studies right now, it is definitely not, and I can't stress this enough, it's definitely not about getting a one-to-one replication. Right, and you can see that by the very fact that I'm changing the perspective. Right, I'm not drawing exactly what I see here. I'm trying to push myself to get a better understanding of what is it that's here. What's this 3D form? Because that's, at the end of the day, a lot more important. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is something to be said, and there are a lot of positives in terms of trying to draw something, to replicate something as is. There's a lot of benefits to it. There's a lot of skills you pick up for it. But I don't think you really need a demo for that. I mean, you literally just look at a picture and then you figure it out, right? You just look at the picture and then you draw it. So I think that's a bit of a waste of time if we did some demo videos on it, because it's really something that you could do yourself. And the only thing that's potentially stopping you is maybe, it might be that you lack a little bit of confidence and you need, you're not quite there yet, or you're just, not to put it too delicately, just a little bit too lazy. Now, I like to believe that for most people, it comes down, it's an issue of confidence and not an issue of laziness. So I'm mapping this window around to be able to get it in here, the right height. Well, I don't know if the microphone is picking it up. I do apologize if you can hear some sirens in the background. I think there's a fire nearby. You can hear the fire department racing through with their sirens. But if you can't, fantastic. It's not going to bother you at all. Let's get those windows in. And down here, we can also start to put in some of the garage door windows. Now there's 4 of these, so I'm kind of gonna work my way in to make sure that they're evenly kind of separated out, and then I'll just mark out kind of the vertical sections of them. Pull them out. Let's kind of fatten up I just want to fatten out the line weight towards the bottom, because otherwise I'm going to start seeing these lines. I can get them confused with something else. So I just want to help myself a little bit, beef out some line weight before things get a little bit too messy. But also, I think one important thing it's very good to remind ourselves that studies are, at the end of the day, they're just for us, so they can truly be as messy or as clean as you want them to be. No one else ever needs to see these. Of course, you guys are seeing this because I'm drawing it, but for your own studies, it doesn't. No one really needs to see them. They're just for you. They're literally studies just for you to figure out how something would look. So if you're on a new project or something, it's not uncommon for designers and artists, if they're on a new project, to do some studies to kind of get a bit of a refresher on the subject matter. Alright, so if I'm doing some medieval project and it's been a while since I've drawn some medieval buildings, then as a bit of a refresher, I'd go do some studies on them. Client doesn't need to know, and also it's not really important for the client to know. That it's not an issue that they need to be worried about. It's purely, again, just for us to refresh. Kind of like if you need to drive somewhere, you haven't driven somewhere for a little while, you're probably going to have a look at the map, right? Get like a street directory, go on Google Maps or something like that. Nobody really cares. Like no one is really going to, you're not really going to tell people like, hey, I had to, remind myself what this place or where this place was on Google Maps, anything like that. No one cares. It's just, it's not terribly exciting. It's the same thing when we're doing our studies. No one really cares. Right, this is for us. It's to refresh ourselves. If we've been hired for a project, it's just expected that we know this stuff, or it's expected that we go do this stuff. Right, so again, that roof line in. Now I'm being kind of soft with my line work here. Using these very thin lines to kind of draw. If you don't like that, you don't have to do it like that. Like again, studies are just meant for you, so you can really draw this however you please. So if you prefer your line work to be a little bit more forceful, have a little bit more presence, then by all means. Generally speaking, I like to have sort of thinner lines, especially after I did these as the line, as the line work kind of got thicker and thicker. I'm actively kind of trying to pull it back just so that I have a little bit more range to work with. Because if you go too thick, then you don't really have much to play with. Your range is a little bit limited. So I don't think this building doesn't really have a lot of. Its garden's pretty much it's just grass. It's a very modernist sort of looking building, or modern sort of design, not modernist, because that's a very different thing. No plants on this. Kind of ideal for someone like me, if I'm very bad at keeping plants alive. So it's got stairs here. I'm just representing it as a ramp, but I don't necessarily have to. Can go in and I'll start cutting in the stairs. Pull that back. A little bit of bottom section here. Thicken out that roof line. I guess this is more of an awning than anything else. I have no idea if there's windows on this side or not. Most likely if this part is white, there might be a part line that runs down here, or this might continue back like this until it hits this part, and there might be a color change. A couple other things we can add on. This is pulling in from a little bit of information from here, but just general things about housing is that you might have drainage sections for the roof, and they might have small sort of pipes, drains or gutters that might run down. I think from this angle they'll be kind of hidden. And we did have these sconce lights over here. And there's probably going to be some in here, because they're going to want to match, right? So if you are coming up into this driveway, you're walking to this house, you've got these lights here, you probably want lights here leading to the door. And it's just a safety feature. You want lights a little bit further away from the door so that you can see someone approaching. So if you look at most houses, like even something like this, they'll probably have a light somewhere around the there might be a little brick wall or something. They might have a light out here, or they might have a sensor light that might project out. Because you ever been inside a house at night and you try and look out, or even in an apartment building, you can't really see much. I think this is a little bit off. And let's start to put in the rest of these windows. So some of the perspective is a little bit wonky, and I'm just kind of correcting it as I go. Again, these are studies, so I'm not terribly fussed about this. I know that at the end of the day, I'm actually going to be doing, if I'm actually really doing studies, I'm going to be doing a lot of these. So if I'm doing a lot of these, I don't necessarily need them all to be perfect. I just need them to give me or to teach me enough. And if I like a couple of them, I might then take the time and effort to really tidy them up. But that's then, like, at that point, that's really just sort of self-satisfaction and a little bit of pride, right? And we want a little bit of pride. You want to take pride in your work. And that's pretty important. This side we've got this really big window that runs kind of over. Again, my main priority for when I'm doing these studies is information. How much can I learn from this drawing? Or from this drawing, how much can I learn of that reference image? Already you can see there's a little bit of difference. I made this part a little bit thinner, a little bit narrower compared to this. In the 3/4 view, it's a little bit wider. So if I want to match it, I can just bring it back in a little bit more. Now again, these guys don't have to match perfectly. I think if I was to look at this building or this house, my takeaway for this in terms of what's important will really be this, the way the roof is constructed. I think that's probably the most visually or architecturally impactful element of this. That's what would make this building or this house look interesting. Let's shift this across a little bit more to the left so I get a bit more space, because I have a feeling that this house, in terms of this roof, probably extends back. Right, since typically for houses, the base is always the bigger side, or it's always the bigger of everything else. So things kind of nests, everything else kind of nests on top and gets smaller and smaller. So I think it's probably something like this. But I'm not sure. I can't see the back. I have to use my best judgment to kind of guess. And we've got a window on this side. Door is over here. The window is pretty close. Now he's trying to keep it relatively the same size as everything else. It's kind of like a window section here next to the door. And so now that I have this, I'm looking at this as like, oh, okay, this is way too wide. I think this probably would get cut. Well, the roof is here, but the actual building, because it's a little bit offset, is probably there. So let's bring this back a little bit more. So a little bit of back and forth with this. Now, of course, if you're drawing these and you want something that's a little bit more precise, you can always find more reference images, right? A house like this is pretty iconic. It's pretty visually unique. So finding different angles of it is, you know, relatively straightforward. And why I like to use real estate websites or like realty websites is that they generally have a floor plan as well. This is not, you know, not necessarily about kind of inundating myself with information, but it's more about it's a little bit more about, I want to be able to check, you know, after I've done this, I want to be able to have some stuff that I can check and say, oh, how close did I get? Right? How close did I get in what I thought was the right scale, the right proportions, and so on. Sometimes, you know, sometimes it works, and I hit it pretty dead on the, you know, nail on the head sort of thing. Sometimes I am really way off, and it's good to be able to see that sort of stuff. We want to be able to know when we've done a good job, and we want to know when we've kind of really dropped the ball on something. After all, if you don't really know what you're doing, and that if you don't have a clear objective, and you don't have the ability to kind of gauge whether what you're doing is, you know, actually benefiting you or anything like that, then you know, you're kind of fucking spiders. It's not, you're not really getting anything out of it. Let's beef up let's start to beef up some of the line weight, at least with this abstract shadow line at the bottom. So it's not a real shadow, it's more of like an abstract representation of a shadow. It's just there to help us understand, you know, what overhangs what makes contact, you know, with what, etc. So on the bottom, it's kind of trying to mimic an occlusion shadow, and at the top here, it's trying to mimic a cast shadow, right, for the overhang of the roof. Because we can actually go in and we could plot the shadows. Sometimes, just at least at this stage, when we're just trying to get the line work up and running, that isn't necessary. Well, I mean, I guess nothing's really necessary, but we don't need to commit resources to it right now. We can do it later. Let's kind of punch out some of these corners a little bit more. And so now I'm starting to get, you know, a pretty good representation of a 3D version of the house. So we have a 2D side view, So this is our side elevation. And now we have our 3/4 view, or our 3/4 elevation. And I think there was a fence that went on this side. Nearly forgot about that. It's a little bit recessed in. And it wasn't too high, so it looks like it might match somewhere around here. It's probably, if I don't know, looking at a house like this, there probably is a pool in the back, so it's probably something to do with health and safety sort of council rules. You know, you got to have a fence that has like a self-closing door or something like that. I remember when the council where I lived kind of changed their rules, it was an absolute pain in the ass to update our existing fence, because I had a pool in my old house and then we got rid of it, we buried it, but for the council we were still registered to have a pool, so we still needed to get like a self-closing door for the backyard, which is a bit of annoying for this non-existent pool. Just kind of beefing out some of these corners just so that it reads a little better in terms of where the shadow points are. Let's dig into this so I get a better sense of these little glass panels in the garage. Is there anything else that we're missing? I think it's a pretty simple design. Well, I guess at this point, I think this is a little bit too high. Since we can see a little bit more, we can also put in a little bit of that paving. It looks like it's really just where the garage is. That's going to come out here. Well, that's a little bit off. Something like this. And there's a weird sort of like rectangle bit here that's just, I think it's just trying to create a spot color to mirror. I'm talking about this part here. It's probably creating a spot color to mirror the timber color up here. It's more of a graphic visual sort of thing. Nothing structural. There's this little geometric path that goes there, and it looks like there's a door on this side, and we're going to have some form of path that leads over there. Something like this. And since it's sitting on grass, one side is probably going to be, it's going to look pretty flush, and the other side is where we're going to see a little bit of that depth, right, where it rises out off the grass. Same thing we can apply to these little stone platforms. I'm sure there's a landscaping term for these. Again, I'm not a landscape artist, so I don't really care. Probably going to see some little ventilation sections up here. Again, this is pulling out just general knowledge about houses. Yeah, if you do enough of these studies, you start to give yourself that visual library that you can actually put these things in. It's probably hidden at back with there's probably going to be like AC units or something. It's going to probably sit at the top, maybe an evaporative cooler or something. Looks like a house like this probably has an evaporative cooler. Like I can imagine people living here wanting that, right? Paying for it. Although I don't know where this house is, because you can't really use evaporative coolers if it's too humid. There might be something up here, or there might be sort of like air conditioning, like traditional air conditioning units on the back of the house. Maybe hidden along here, there might be where the hot water heater and everything is. Who knows? All right, more sort of guttering systems that might run down. So it's very important when you're dealing with these designs, or if you are designing your own building, it's very important to kind of have these things in mind. Like, look out for them in real buildings, because it's this sort of stuff. These aren't, I wouldn't necessarily consider them details, but it's the little things like this that start to make something really big feel more realistic, feel more to scale. Because you need this stuff. Like, you know, on a little shack, you probably don't care about, you know, it's small enough that things will just drain off. But on a larger building, if you don't drain the water, it pools and it's going to start damaging the overall structure. I don't really know what the roof of this is going to look like. Probably some simple slate. Let's kind of just tighten up this at the back. I think there's a window at the back over here. Like, I can see through this front window and then out the back. So let me stick a window here. And it looks like the window is a little bit smaller. And for us to be able to see through, to catch it there, it's probably positioned a little further back. And there's probably going to be windows down here as well. This is a family home, so it makes sense that they would have, you know, as much light as they can. Especially if there's a fence here. It's kind of like something, you know, potentially you can imagine like a living room being positioned here. You might have the same sort of window design as what's at the front of the house. All right, and so that pretty much marks the end of the study, at least for this version, right? Because we can keep noodling this and we can add more and more stuff to it, but what we're trying to get out of this design, or what we're trying to get out of this exercise, we've already hit, which is we're looking at the photograph, we're interpreting that photograph as a 2D version. We would then interpret it as kind of like a halfway point, like a 2.5D version, which we've done previously. And then the final step is, okay, let's take all that information and let's actually turn it into a 3/4 view, which is the drawing that we have here. And the idea is that you would want to do as many of these as you can. And I think a good time, a good sort of time bracket to give yourself would be, I think something like this. As of now, if I'm looking at this recording, for just this section, it's sitting at like 34 minutes or 35 minutes, something like that. So I think that if as a beginner, I think probably 45 minutes on something like this is pretty good. And then if you can drop it down to somewhere along the lines of 30 minutes, I think you're going to be in pretty safe hands. For your 2D element, I think for this, probably no more. I would say, at the beginning, it might take you 20 minutes. But ideally, I would say if you could drop this down to 10 minutes, that would be pretty good, because it's a very simple, just a front view. It shouldn't be too complicated. And then for our 2.5D, I think something like this, probably, let's say about 30 minutes. Right, in the beginning, maybe again, if you're kind of struggling with your drawings, I think 45 minutes. And then if you can drop this down to, let's say, around 30 minutes, you'll also be in a pretty good position. And obviously, as you do more, you'll just get faster. You get faster and faster and faster. And at some point, a drawing like this is probably going to drop down to the 10-minute mark, right? A drawing like this is probably going to drop down to the 5-minute mark. And this, could probably even drop down to even just the 20-minute mark. Now, I don't particularly like using time as a gauge for, in terms of like a speed thing, because I think it's kind of silly. If you want to do anything that has value, if you want to do anything that has that results in something that has a good quality to it, timing how fast you are is not ideal. What you want to look at, if you want anything of quality, it's going to take time. But it is a good metric of when you're starting out. It is a good metric if you're learning as a gauge. So if you're finding that an image like this, let's say for whatever reason, takes you 3 hours, right? That's fine. So long as when you do it again or you do something similar, that you get it at 2 hours and 59 minutes. And you slowly work your way down until you hit something like this. But if you're just, and this is more about, the speed is more of a representation of your proficiency. If you're just chasing speed for the sake of chasing speed, at least in my opinion, it's about the dumbest thing you could do, right? You're just wasting time. If you're trying to practice something, you need to put in time, and you need to be okay that it's going to take time to learn things, and that if you want to do anything that is of quality, if you want to do anything that's good, it's naturally it will take time to do that as well. So I'm just looking back at the image, and I think I probably made the garage door a little bit higher than it really should. It probably should sit about there, but it doesn't matter. If I want to fix it, rather than kind of fix it in this drawing, I'll just draw it again, right? I think it's going to be a much better way of doing it. But since this is for a demo, I'm going to take this, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm just going to squish this down. Although some of the perspective is going to get messed up, so we just might have to redo them. And let's take this, cut it about there. I'll take that it's this weird sort of part line that runs across here, like a feature line. Let's place it back. Again, looking at that photograph, looking at my initial drawing, right, that feature line runs pretty much at the base of this overhang, and then the garage door is below it. Right, something like this. Which probably mean that this probably continues through this side as a nice sort of graphic. All right, so there you have it, guys. This is a walkthrough of how I would approach doing studies for buildings or structures, things that are much bigger than what we'd have in our day-to-day contact. And this would be the approach that I'd use for even something like, let's say an oil tanker or an aircraft carrier or even a jumbo jet. I'll take this approach. It's a very good way of, at least I feel that it's a very good way of approaching a subject matter that is larger than life, right? That is very overwhelming, very intimidating, and approaching it in a way that we're slowly layering on the difficulty. And so at the end of the day, after we've gone through all these steps, it's not as intimidating anymore. It's not as complicated, right? Each step we're increasing that difficulty a little bit by a little bit and a little bit. So by the time that we want to do a 3/4 view, we have a lot of that information already. We know what's going on. Right? The hard part of drawing big structures or just big things in general is that we are trying to figure it out while we're drawing. And if you're trying to do that, it's a lot of stuff that you have to process, and it's very overwhelming. So if you cut it down to just very simple steps at set intervals or set iterations, it is going to make your life a lot easier, and it is going to allow you to keep that momentum going when you're doing these sketches. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. In the future, we might do a part 3. Since we've done animals, and then we're doing, this one was buildings. If we do a part 3, then it might be something along the lines of vehicles, and we might look specifically into things like the wheel length of vehicles and how we might go about calculating that, and how you might go about drawing or freehand sketching things that have a lot more curves, things that have a lot more elliptical elements involved, that aren't animals, that aren't organic, that are still hard surface manufactured things. All right, well, Thank you very much, guys, and I hope you enjoy this demo and you're able to get a lot out of it.